really, really work on your relationships with your team. Make yourself an open book that everybody feels like they can come to you and discuss. And that gets back to a comment that you made that I don't think that we hammered home enough, which is the grievance policy. If someone feels uncomfortable or something feels off, whether it's a teacher or a staff member or a parent, you want to have that culture in your company of open channels of communication.
Hey, welcome back to the podcast. Today, we are joined once again by Stephanie for our Ask an Attorney series. And today we're dealing with something a little bit more serious. And we want to dive into how to protect a studio, how to protect the owners of the studio in delicate situations where accusations have come up around different topics. And I'm being a little delicate here because I think this is a weightier, more serious issue. And even right now, I can think of a studio where an accusation was made of inappropriate conduct of an employee of that studio. So we brought Stephanie on because we'd like to just get your perspective. So welcome back, Stephanie.
Thank you. I'm happy to be back.
So Stephanie, love having you back on. Thanks again for joining us, as always. I kind of want to open with just a really general question and just hoping to get kind of a 10,000 foot answer on this, which is just like, can you describe like some of the most important liability issues that we as owners of a studio that have employees, that have teachers, whether they're contractors or W-2, doesn't matter in my mind, but as employers, what are the most important liability issues that we should just be aware of out of the gate? Because that's, I think we got to just start there. Like, because I know as an owner, Stephanie, I'll just say this, I wasn't even aware that I needed to be aware, 13 years ago, that there was even, that I was liable for things. I was just a guy with a curriculum psyched to start helping students. So let's start there if we could.
Right. And I think you bring up a really good point that you don't know what you don't know. And a lot of entrepreneurs are just excited to dive in and get going with their business. But it's extremely important to consult important advisors in the arena. I think we talked a little bit about it last time we spoke, but as business owners, you definitely need to develop a team of trusted advisors, which should include an attorney, a banker, an insurance agent, and a CPA. And as it relates to liability, each of those advisors will be able to provide a perspective on different liabilities that you should be aware of. Specifically, when it comes to the topic at hand today, the different liabilities include discrimination claims in terms of hiring, firing, promotions, and then also harassment claims. And that can be harassment of employees by other employees, customers by your employees, or harassment from an owner to an employee. And so those are kind of the bigger topics and bigger liabilities that you would want to consult your advisors with to protect yourself as much as you can against those liabilities. But the fact of the matter is, if you're in business long enough, you're likely going to see one of these claims come up, whether or not they have merit. It's just a fact of business, because unfortunately we can't make everybody happy all the time.
Let's focus for now on me as an owner, right? Just understanding how to sort of, like I say, protect myself. I don't know what the right term is. Actually, just become aware of all the scenarios and how to put myself in the best situation to be able to address any one of them. So maybe where do you want to start, Stephanie, in terms of just like, because I always like the question of like, Daniel and I always say, like, what can someone listening do right now beyond find that relationship with an attorney to begin to better understand the pieces they need to put in place to be protected or be in the best position possible to handle a situation that's uncomfortable.
Right. So one of the most important things, which can be difficult, particularly for small owners, is documentation, and is making sure that you have clear policies at the outset in terms of what your harassment policy is. It's typically referred to as anti-harassment. All your employees know, your customers know, that this type of behavior is not tolerated at the business. And then in terms of complaints, it's important that your employees know and you have a documented kind of grievance policy such that, if you become aware of this behavior or you're feel uncomfortable because of behavior of another employee or customer, like here's the complaint process that you should follow. And all of those items should be documented. At the start, when you're a small business, you likely don't have an HR person. The owner is probably your human resources person. So it can be easy to forget that it's important either to have another witness, in the room, or get permission to record the conversation or take notes and send a follow-up email. It's something like, we spoke today. This is what we spoke about. Please let me know if I misunderstood anything that was said. Because what you're doing is you're creating a paper trail in the event anything escalates, and you do need to kind of go back and see what happened. And it's more than just he said, she said, to a certain degree. Obviously the notes are your perspective on what was said, but it's better than, trying to recall a conversation a year later without any documented reference. So that's one thing employers can do right now.
Let me ask a question about something you said there, because you said you want to have this document, you want to have this anti-harassment policy to be known. In working with studio owners over the years, I've given advice, not around a legal thing. I've given advice around, hey, be careful what how you introduce who your studio is to your prospective clients. Mm-hmm. And I've even said things like, don't put your policies right out front on your marketing website. Like, wait till they at least show they're interested in joining your studio before you start. How would you recommend revealing like an anti-harassment policy to someone in the studio when that's something we really don't want parents thinking about when they're thinking about dropping their kids off at our studio, So what do you think would be the best way to introduce something like that?
So in terms of an anti-harassment policy, typically that would be like in an employee handbook or at your place of business. If there are any state required or federal required notices, like being an equal opportunity employer or that kind of thing that has to be posted at your place of business, that could be a good place to post the anti-harassment policy. And then if people have, like a client handbook or a customer packet of information or something, it might be a place to put it in there, like when they sign up and agree to enroll their child for classes, if there's certain things that they have to agree to, just having the anti-harassment policy in there, because they also have to abide by that policy, right? That you don't want the parents or the customers, they're children, but doesn't mean they can't, I guess, engage in certain behaviors that would fall under that. But, you want them to abide by your policies as well, because that's protecting your employees.
Then I think I have a follow-up question to that. And this is a little bit more real world. And I think it goes to what Nate was asking earlier. As an owner, what can you do to protect yourself, the studio, the students in the studio? There is a situation I became aware of where a parent came to the studio owner and said that our child said this conduct happened between one of your teachers and our child. They hadn't gone to the police. I'm curious, as a studio owner, as an attorney, what advice would you give to a studio owner and how to handle that situation? That's a very sticky situation. The parents were saying, we don't want to get the police involved, but this happened. That's a tough situation. How would you respond to that?
Well, just based on the hypothetical that you've given, it's extremely difficult to provide advice on that, because it would definitely depend on the severity of the conduct. Number one thing that owner should do is call their attorney in that situation. Wow. Whenever there is an allegation that inappropriate conduct occurred between an employee and a client, particularly if the client is a minor, you need to get your attorney involved right away. You also potentially need to refer to your insurance policies, because you may have some coverage for employer practices liability potentially. And under those insurance policies, you have to notify them of any potential claims within a certain time period for that coverage to kick in. So there's a few steps that somebody should take in that situation, but I cannot give you specific, advice on that.
Then let me ask one other follow-up question. Obviously, those situations are very volatile. There's a lot of each situation like this would be unique. For the best outcome possible, what should the studio owner have done prior to any situation happening that would set them up to most protect themselves and the studio from liability of the conduct of an employee beforehand, other than the anti-harassment policy that you'd indicated earlier?
Right. Well, as I briefly mentioned, there may be certain insurance coverages that can help from the cost perspective. So definitely talking to your insurance agent about that. But in terms of doing what you can to set yourself up in the best possible situation when it comes to the situation you just described, is really having a good screening and hiring process to know who you are hiring and putting in the classroom with your students.
So in other words, and then Nate, I want to bounce it over to you. So in other words, it's not an option to forego background checks when you're hiring someone, things of that nature, just like basic common sense, which again, we call it common sense, but there are studios that don't. I know that there are studios out there that have not run background checks.
So Stephanie, I'm sure that we found like a cut and paste to start at BMF. I can't tell you exactly where, how, or who did it, but I promise you we were looking somewhere for a simple starting point, and then we were revising with our own language around that to make it look and feel like BMF. Is there somewhere people can start to just like a free resource where they can just go and be like, okay, I can at least have a template for an employee handbook?
I'm sure there are lots of resources online, that you could Google and find. However, I think a better way to go is there are lots of companies or consulting companies out there that provide these types of services and likely can provide it for relatively inexpensive amounts. But I think that, again, you've got to view it as an investment in the future of your business. And while it can be difficult to, pay $500 or whatever the cost may be for somebody to put your employee handbook together or to purchase a template or whatnot, having the comfort of knowing that it came from a human resources company or a consultant who regularly works in the industry is important, I think, to help set somebody up to be in the best possible position. Attorneys can write the employee handbook as well, but from a cost efficient perspective, it's probably not necessarily a route that somebody just starting out would be able to do. So I would recommend looking at some human resource consulting companies that provide those services.
I love that. I just literally Googled Gusto that's our virtual HR service we use that does our payroll, and they help with making sure that we meet all of our tax obligations, other things. And I did a quick Google, just Gusto employee handbook, and the first thing that comes up is the ultimate employee handbook guide. That's like a downloadable resource from Gusto. So that's such an awesome piece of advice, which is great because you frame it in ways that make sense to us. Number one, we're like, hey, we need to be efficient with our budget. Don't go to your attorney and be like, let's write this thing together, because you're going to find yourself, many thousands of dollars in the hole asking for their time on something, where instead you can start in a more efficient way by finding, another resource that will be more affordable. And then I think from there, you can go back to your attorney, right? And say, hey, I proposed this thing. Can I ask for, can I buy an hour of your time to review the thing and just highlight some areas?
I'm glad you went back to that, because I was going to go back and clarify that after it is complete, you definitely should contact your attorney and say, hey, listen, we've just put together this employee handbook. Would you mind taking a look and making sure that it's in compliance with any state or federal regulations that we should be aware of? And that way they're not writing the whole thing from scratch. They would be reviewing it, and they may have some changes based on state or local laws that someone like a human resources company, there's maybe more standard. There may be some specific things that need to be added based on your jurisdiction. So definitely recommend having your attorney review it, but there may be a more cost-efficient way to start out as opposed to having an attorney draft the whole thing.
I love it. Okay, I have a follow-up question. I'm gonna ping it back to you, Daniel, see where your head's at on this. You mentioned documentation, and I first wanted to give a couple of little hacks that BMF has learned to do over the years. First of all, we do everything in G Suite, so it's all Gmail and G Docs and G Drives and G blah blah blah. And so the very first thing that happens whenever we're even considering a new hire is we create a folder for them. So we just have hundreds and hundreds of folders for potential employees. And that begins that process of documentation. So anytime something comes up, for example, maybe they communicate inappropriately in Slack to our director, or maybe we get an email complaint from a parent around some experience that they had in the classroom, we'll just do a screenshot and drop it into the folder. And it's not to be like, hey, it's not like this big brother thing. It's exactly what you're talking about. It's like, if down the line we ever need to have a conversation, then we're not relying on our memory. Right? And so it brings up a couple of little key points here. This is why you have a company email address that your employees use, right? Because you want everybody to be communicating in your actual business channel. This is why a tool like Slack is so valuable to actually spend the money on, right? Rather than just use the free service, because you can then research all of the historical communication, which we've actually had to do a few times. We've had to go back to 2019 and take a look at what the conversation between two people and be like, wait, is that actually, did we really say that? Or is that selective memory? And go back to that conversation, because we're all super busy. And that tool is a tool like Slack is built specifically to help you do the research if and when you need it. Right. Stephanie, anything you want to add on to that, thoughts in terms of other ways that you can quickly and simply document and sort of organize around these things? Is there any additional thoughts before we ping back to Daniel?
No, I guess the only thing that I would add in terms of classrooms, and I know everybody has a different opinion on this, but I know in recent years it's become more popular, but having those classes live streamed for parents to be able to watch. But that also gives you another avenue, because most of those services, when something is live streamed, you can also have a recording of it. So you can have a recording as to what happened in the classroom, because as an owner, or if you have a manager at your facility, they're only one person. They can't be in every classroom if you have multiple classrooms. And so being able to have that documented can end up being very helpful if something comes up in the future, an allegation of some sort. You can go back and actually take a look.
Yeah,
I think.
Go ahead, Daniel.
I was just going to say, I think that's a good note on which to maybe summarize and kind of go into the close here on this episode. The punch list, as we've been talking over the last 25 minutes or so, the punch list of things that studio owners need to be aware of, keep in mind, is no matter what, if there's any kind of accusation from any of these parties to another one, call your attorney first.
Yeah.
Make sure that you have some sort of written policy that you've run past your attorney, on the record, that you've given to all parties involved with your studio. Document everything. If you're ever in a conversation that you think could have any potentially probative value in the future, you should be recording that and making sure all parties present know it's being recorded. A good rule of thumb for any studio with a commercial location, and this has saved a couple people I know, is having that surveillance system kind of in place where things are actually being recorded. Have we missed anything in the recap here? Was there anything else that we said from the past half hour that I'm forgetting? Anybody?
Stephanie, do you hear anything?
No, I don't think so. I think that was a pretty good summary of what we discussed. And as Nate said earlier, it's not from a big brother perspective, but it is very important, because a lot of times in these cases, if it gets that far down the road, it is a matter of one person says this thing happened, whereas another person said, no, it didn't. This is how it happened. And so that documentation can really make or break a case depending on what's there. And so I just can't overstress the importance of it. And it's something very easy that you can put in place right now without too much cost.
Wow. I really hope whoever's listening to this will let those words ring in their ear, because this could save people a lot of trouble in the future, to know that needs to happen, and then it's not overkill or a useless action, that they really should be doing those sorts of things. And the other thing I think we kind of picked up from this is that, we did kind of focus on the owner's perspective here, but the same thing would be true. Everything I just said in that punch list a minute ago, the same thing would be true when it comes to trying to protect your employee. There's really nothing else that we can do except have this documentation in place and just make sure that we've notified all parties of what the standards are in the studio. That's really the way to protect the employee as well. Cool.